sound is.
Nick, you've come back for another episode, mate.
We have, mate. I was going to say we're a glutton for punishment, but, hey, we need to talk to people and if you want to drink and eat.
Absolutely. Why wouldn't you come back when you've got guests as good as these, right?
Definitely, mate. I'm looking forward to this one. It's going to be a great episode.
Just in the last few weeks, we've had the Greek Rugby League boys, we've had Mark Bouris. Now we're taking it up a level in terms of the arts and writing, would you believe? So, mate, you want me to tell you who we've brought? Gracing us with her presence in the Distillery today is an internationally acclaimed author, poet and storyteller whose works have sold over 1 million copies. She has a doctorate of creative arts in fairy tale studies and is an accredited master storyteller with the Australian Guild of Storytellers. She's also taught writing retreats in Australia, Fiji, Greece and the UK. Just some of her works include Beauty and Thorns, a reimagining of Sleeping Beauty told in the voice of 4 women of the pre-Raphaelite circle of artists and poets. The Wild Girl, the story of the forbidden romance behind the Grimm brothers' fairy tales, which was named Most Memorable Love Story of 2013 by Australian readers. And Bitter Greens, a reinvention of Rapunzel, which won the 2015 American Library Association Award for Best Historical Fiction.
Wow.
Her most recent novel, though, is The Crimson Thread, a reimagining of the Minotaur in the Labyrinth myth, set in Crete during the Nazi invasion and occupation of World War II. She's not Greek. I defy you to read The Crimson Thread, though, and not come away thinking that she's anything but, though. I mean, you've started reading it, haven't you, Nick?
Listening to it now. Thanks to you. I'm on these audio books now,
You're
which
on the
I'm
audio
really loving.
train. Fantastic. Well, it is a fantastic book. Whether you're reading it or listening to it, whatever it is well worth getting. Dr. Kate Forsyth, welcome to Uzo Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. It's such a pleasure to be here. And already so well looked after.
We're only just starting.
We couldn't do this conversation without the person who actually introduced us to Kate. So while we'd heard the name before and we'd heard about the amazing work, we have a returning guest in the form of Theodora Gianniotis, who's come from the Australian Archaeological Institute of Athens at Sydney University, who was the one who actually told us about Kate. Theodora, welcome back to Uzo Talk.
Any invitation from you guys is warmly welcome to come back under the guise of career, but there's the Uzo and the food and there's my favourite author, so thank you for listening to me, and I think it's going to be a amazing episode.
And she really is your favourite author, isn't she? I mean, when you called me and said you have to get her on the podcast, like, she couldn't have been more forceful about it.
I couldn't have been, and when I saw The Crimson Thread, I literally sent one of those emails to Kate through her website.
Yep.
And thought a publisher was just going to reach out. Within 2 minutes, I hear Kate's voice on the other side of the phone, and I couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
I was like, what? Really? No, this is not happening. I think I've read nearly every single book that Kate's made. The reimagining and retelling of myths and storytelling has been something I've loved from a little girl, and to have someone articulate it for me is a dream come true.
You're among fans here, Kate. I tell you, you've got 3 fans in us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
On that note, Nick, what do you reckon? Should we get into the episode properly?
I think so, mate. It's time for a drink.
Absolutely. Let's go for it. Siniyamas.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Yeah.
Welcome,
Cheers.
officially.
All right. So, Nick, there's a couple of things happening on the table here in terms of the drinks. The first one, we've got the karaki again, because we didn't actually manage to polish that bottle for last episode, did we?
No, we didn't. We were so intrigued by conversation when we forgot to drink. We had an initial toast and we're just so intrigued.
Absolutely.
Never got around to finishing off the bottle.
So we have unfinished business is what you're saying now.
I think so. We have to finish it off today.
But we've also got a nice bottle of wine here, the Moschofilero, which is a fantastic wine from Skouras. I'm not sure if you ladies have tried this one.
I have.
But it is a fantastic drop.
This is one of my favourite.
Really?
In terms of Greek wines, it is pretty unique, isn't it? You're a bit of a connoisseur of white wine now, Kate, aren't you?
Look, any wine, really. But I must admit, one of the great pleasures of travelling in Greece was discovering the Greek wine, which was new to me. It was wonderful. Of course, I knew all about the food.
Yeah.
But the wine, that was wonderful.
Did you have a favourite wine when you were there at all?
So we really loved it while we were on Crete because
Okay.
we visited quite a few of the vineyards there, and I used to like the stories that they would tell us when they would serve the wine. They would say things like, "Yes, this comes from a vine that grows on the flank of where Zeus is sleeping," or something like this. I loved it.
Nothing's ever straightforward there, is it?
No. Everything has a story. And then, of course, as soon as they worked out that we were Australian, they would sit down, they'd order more wine, and they'd start telling us stories, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Nothing like a Greek telling stories, eh?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the thing as well. It doesn't matter whether it's the wine or, for me personally, I've heard it in particular when it comes to instruments. There's always a story behind the piece of wood that they've made this instrument out of, or something along those lines. I mean, for you, Kate, going to a place like Crete, and, you know, obviously you went as part of your research for your book, what was it like being there for you personally? Had you been to Greece before?
I had been to Greece before, and I'd wanted to go to Greece ever since I was a teenager and first had what I like to call my Greek craze,
Right.
where, you know, I was reading the Greek myths and reading Greek history and reading,
Wow.
you know, books set in Greek. So I had been there before. I went there for my 40th birthday as my present to myself. But I'd never been to Crete, and it was just as extraordinary as I'd hoped it would be. You know, the culture and the geography with, you know, those really high towering white mountains, and then, you know, the sun-shot ocean. It's just beautiful. And I love the kind of philosophy of life in Greece, you know, the love of life and music and dancing and art and storytelling and food and wine and this, you know, kind of enormous generosity of spirit. I just really responded to that. It was everything I hoped it would be.
Wow, so you gravitated that life. As you can see why we all miss it when we leave and we want to go back.
Honestly, everywhere we went, we were welcomed so warmly and with, you know, music and laughter and great food. And everyone had a story to tell, whether it was about how their grandfather is ploughing up the field and they find machine gun pellets, for example, and then, you know, someone else will go in and say, well, can you remember the time we found a marble arm? you know, there's this sense of layers and layers and layers of history in Greece, which I just find so beautiful and fascinating and powerful.
So what was your connection to it? I mean, I read a story recently, an article where you mentioned, you know, the amount of reading you did as a child and where you had read the myths, and in particular, you know, the myth of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. What was it like for you to be in that setting and thinking, wow, this is where this story came from or originated from?
I mean, you know, the Palace of Knossos is just incredible. It does give you an enormous kind of labyrinthine feel, all those walls, and if you get down in them, it does feel like a maze. And it's such an ancient city, you know. It has the first road in Europe. It has the first throne in the world. I love the fact that when it was excavated, Sir Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist, called it the throne of the priest king, but anthropologists now think it must have been made for a woman because of the ample size of the buttocks.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow, there you
Yeah,
go.
so it was really a throne for a queen priestess, rather than a king priest.
That's interesting, and we won't launch into your book, but there's a particular section of your book where you retell Ariadne's story as the powerful woman.
Yeah, that's right. You know, when I first read the Greek myths, when I was in my early teens, I can remember that Roger Lancelin Green, the British author who retold them in English for children, he said, if you're ever lucky enough to visit the land of Greece, you will find a country that is haunted by more than 3,000 years of history and legend.
Wow.
So that was what really caught my attention. But then he really rewrote the myths for boys, and so there was an awful lot of boys, I don't know, killing things, and an awful lot of girls who were sort of being turned into echoes, echo, or into, laurel trees, or being cursed with snakes for hair, or being turned into birds. The story of Ariadne and the Labyrinth was the one tale in the book where a young woman had a vital role to play. And also she was described as having this wild, dark beauty and being a dark-haired girl. I was a bit sick of all the blonde heroines of, British fairy tales. I was quite glad to have a wild, dark beauty in there. So, I just really responded to that. In the tale, usually told, Ariadne either dies or she's abandoned by Theseus. But in the older versions of the tale, she becomes a goddess, and her crown of stars is flung up into the sky and is a navigational tool for those who are lost to find their way home.
Wow.
And I find that so much more beautiful and powerful than, her weeping in despair because she got dumped.
How can you not be inspired by something like that, honestly?
And it is something, Kate's, with all her books, she picks up these women that have fallen through the historical cracks because history was written by men, and we miss out on who the real heroes were. And those heroes, a lot of them were women, and they inspire our young women. And even, as we come back to this conversation, we have forgotten the women of World War II that haven't been honoured, and in particular the civilian women in Greece that were frontline. And Kate's really picked up on that in the book, and she does it in all her books, so it's really well done.
Yeah, I always say I need 3 really strong, compelling story ideas before I know that I have a novel. And, for me, the idea of retelling the Minotaur and the Labyrinth myth and then combining that with the story of the Anzac soldiers that fought on Crete in 1941, including my own great uncle. But I needed something else. And it was when I realised that, many of the civilians who were fighting by the side of the Anzac soldiers were actually women, because so many of the young men had been killed or taken prisoner at the front line in Albania and on the mainland of Greece. And, there were women who were doing incredible acts of courage and heroism, fighting with, kitchen knives tied to broomsticks, for example.
Which is a line in the book as well.
Yeah, that's it. Well, that just struck me so powerfully because, if I had to go out and fight for my country, that's pretty much all I'd have.
Yeah.
And just stumbling upon these extraordinary untold stories of the women of the Cretan resistance, all the hairs raised up on they're actually happening again, just thinking about it, because it was so powerful, and it's a story that so deserves to be better known. It felt like it was just waiting for me to tell it.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm going slightly off script with this sort of question, but now hearing, about the importance of women in, in these historical myths or history or whatever the case is, Professor Paul Cartledge from Cambridge said something along the lines of, when it comes to the heroes, your Achilles and all these types, your heroic status was based essentially on, for example, the amount of women you deflowered and all that sort of thing. As someone who's outside of the Greek tradition, who's not Greek, reading that sort of stuff, how do you interpret that?
Well, I think that there's absolute truth in that. But that's partly because of the fact that for many, many hundreds of years, the only people who were retelling the tales were men. And so they were simply telling the stories that appealed to them, stories of strength and courage, athleticism. But there are other stories that have women at their heart that just haven't got the same kind of cultural traction. So, for example, I'm working with the story of Psyche at the moment.
Wow, okay.
Eros and Psyche is a well-known Greco-Roman myth. It has a young woman at its heart. It just doesn't have the same widespread sort of appeal as the story of, Troy and the Iliad and, Achilles or, Hercules or even Theseus, who, really wasn't a very nice guy, I have to say.
I have to agree.
Yeah.
When you read back on a lot of these things, it's pretty hard to like a lot of these characters, isn't it?
It's like watching a 1970s movie.
Yeah.
You know, the political correctness is it's hard to swallow.
Yeah. But it's played such a key role in shaping the way that our literary history has been formed, hasn't it?
Exactly. But, you know, I'm passionately committed to the idea of discovering untold stories and, you know, bringing them back to life. And by reframing history and reframing myth with a feminist perspective, then what I can do is I can actually adjust the unevenness of our literary history and make sure that going forward, young women know that there are stories about brave, clever, strong and interesting female characters, that they are not all reduced to a spectral echo, you know, simply repeating the words of men.
Absolutely.
And I think the time has never been better for that kind of work, but it's because of this kind of, you know, revisionist work of history and myth by, you know, women writers in the past, that we're now in a position to see a great kind of creative flowering.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, the stories are there. They've just been half forgotten.
Okay, well, I want to talk about how you're bringing this to light, because it's obvious that you've got writing in your DNA. This is, you know, this is almost the family business to some, you know, in some respect. I mean, your siblings, you know, Belinda Murrell, for example, and your younger brother Nick Humphrey, also being authors. It goes just a little bit further than that, though, doesn't it? Tell us a bit about your connection to Charlotte Waring Atkinson.
Yeah, so Charlotte Waring Atkinson is my great-great-great-great-grandmother. So 4 greats and 1 grand. She wrote the first children's book published in Australia. So her book, which is called A Mother's Offering to Her Children by a lady long resident in New South Wales. It was published in 1841, so 181 years ago. And she had 4 children. Her youngest daughter, Louisa Atkinson, is the first Australian-born female novelist in this country.
Wow. Well, when did she arrive to Australia?
She came out to Australia in the late 1820s.
Okay.
And she was married, and her husband lived in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. Mm-hmm. After her husband died, she was left a young widow with, you know, 4 small children, and, you know, through a tragic sequence of events, was really left with nothing. So she had to find a way to support her children, and so she took up her quill, and, you know, with the proceeds of her writing, she was able to support her children until her little son was old enough to inherit, because of course women weren't permitted to inherit property at that time.
I was going to ask, what other options would there have been for a woman of that status back then? Because, I mean, you hear some terrible stories in things like the show Who Do You Think You Are, about people ending up in a poorhouse or something like that.
Yeah, you know, she was desperately poor. She was virtually homeless. She supported the children for quite a while, selling off, you know, furniture and clothes and jewellery, but she had, you know, very few options open to her. After her book was published, she actually opened a school for girls.
Okay.
So she was one of the very first educators in the colony, and she had a particular interest in educating young women who at that time were often ignored and, you know, only given a rudimentary education. So her twin interests, writing and teaching, supported her into her old age. She's an incredible woman, really. She was
a real pioneer, really.
Yeah, she was an absolute
definitely.
pioneer. Her story is an extraordinary one. There's actually poets and novelists and hymn writers and biographies and journalists going back in the Waring family as far back as we can go.
Really?
Yeah, you know.
It's genetic.
It's in the
be.
blood. I really do think that it is. And the fact that in my family, both my brother, my sister and I are all published authors is, I think, unusual.
It's unbelievable. But the unbelievable side of it doesn't really stop there, because there's a connection to Charles Darwin as well in the family, I read.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Charles Darwin was a distant cousin of Charlotte Waring Atkinson. They grew up in Kent, only a few miles away from each other. There was only 12 years between them. You know, it's thought that, you know, they connected when Charles Darwin was here in Australia, and Charles was only here in Sydney for about 12 days, And he somehow managed to go back to England with hundreds and hundreds of insects and butterflies. And so we like to think that Charlotte gave him her collection to help him, because she was very interested in entomology as well.
Wow, how good's that? That is unbelievable.
Story, yeah. Southern Highland bugs.
Yeah.
Hey?
Imagine getting those through customs nowadays, Nick.
No.
It's here to get some ouzo in your Fanta bottle. Through.
Yeah, probably. Pepsi.
That's the tip. That's this stuff.
Yeah.
That's it.
Pepsi bottle, not Fanta.
And you and your sister actually wrote a book together about it, didn't you?
Yeah. So my sister Belinda and I have written a book called Searching for Charlotte, the fascinating story of Australia's first children's author. And it's a combined biography of our ancestor and a memoir of our search to find the truth, because we were brought up on all this very romantic oral family history, and we thought that they must have been very much embellished and exaggerated, and we wanted to know what the real truth was. And also we thought it was a great shame that she was, she had been forgotten. So we wrote the book in time for the 180th anniversary, which was last year. Because if we weren't going to do it then, we're going to have to wait for the 200th. And who knows where we'll be or what we'll be doing then. So it was, seize the day, let's actually do this book.
Well, I want to ask you this question, Theodora, because, okay, now you've heard, or we've all heard, the status of, that Kate has and, the history and whatnot. How does it feel to have, for you personally, to have someone writing about our tradition with that sort of history behind it?
I've got to say I'm a strong believer of people of their own culture using their own voice, but I'm also not so insular to not want to share my culture. So when I read Kate's books, I go on a journey because it's supported with so much research. And the Crimson Thread for me, I went, okay, I love you, Kate, but you've done really well. Let's see how you do with Greek culture. And I open up to page 3, and the first 2 words I see is Sophia Vembor. And straight away I knew she'd done research, because there's so many Greeks that don't even understand that Sophia Vembor was such an undercurrent of the movement. And for Kate to pick it up, the hair stood on end. For me, it was music. I knew it was Ikosok Doktombrio in my house because my mum would play her songs. She came from my mum's village.
Wow. Okay.
She grew up in my mum's village. And when I see people and they do that sort of research into our culture and our traditions, culture is meant to be shared, right?
Definitely.
Or else, what is the richness of it? And Kate has, with every book, I just went, this is going to be good. And it is. And the detail, and I have to ask you, there's particular myths and traditions you've picked up on. Is that something you've researched? Because there are a lot of anecdotal stuff we have heard growing up. Did you research that, or did you, while you were in Crete, you heard it? The doing the cross, all these little nuances that were so detailed, from.
Or telling details, as you put it.
Telling details,
details.
even there was, particular stories of particular caves in Crete. Is that something you researched, or is that something when you got there you found out, or?
I mean, it's all part of the research, but the trip to Crete is part of the research as well. Normally I like to go to a country once I've been really, really deeply immersed in its history and culture for a long time. So part of my research includes listening to the music that my characters would have listened to, eating the food that they would have eaten, which was quite difficult because during the Nazi occupation, the Cretan people were starving. So I ate the food that they would have eaten if they hadn't been in Nazi occupation.
Okay.
Reading the books that they would have read. So I immersed myself in the literature and the poetry. So I was reading Sappho, I was reading Kafali. reading, just being as aware as I can about everything. And then part of my research, the struggle is always to find real primary sources. Now, many of the British who were on Crete during World War II wrote memoirs of their time there, but I had to really dig deep to find memoirs of the Cretan people. And when I did find them, they would have clues or hints or mentions of things, and then I'd simply go digging until I found them.
Was there much in terms of written stuff?
Very little. So I'm sure that you're all aware of the Cretan runner, which is quite well known and has been translated into English. There's another book called Eyewitness Report, first-hand accounts of the invasion, and so that gave me, first-hand, and they were all just, interviews, oral interviews that had been transcribed. When I was actually in Crete, I simply asked everyone, for their memories of the war, and I also asked them to tell me their grandmother's stories.
Yeah, wow.
So I described before that every time that we were asked where we came from, we would say, "Oh, we're from Australia," and people would go, "Australia, welcome, we love you," and then they would sit down and begin to tell me stories, and so I would simply ask them questions about their own personal experiences, and then I would take notes.
Wow.
And filled up a notebook that way, and then I would go and try and find the empirical evidence behind the stories.
Wow.
So you lived and breathed the Cretan lifestyle, essentially.
I did. Wasn't it a fabulous couple of years?
That's a great bit of research.
My children loved it because I do this with every single book. And so we have certain meals or traditions that we kind of build in. But certainly the Cretan food, and not just the Cretan food, but, what was eaten when, religious festivities, things like, wild greens, Cretan greens, what they were, where they were gathered, what healing properties they have. So, I'm interested in social history. I'm interested in the way that ordinary people live and love. And that was probably the greatest challenge of the book, because most of the histories of the Cretan, the Battle of Crete or the occupation, are written by outsiders, and I needed to find the stories of the insiders, of the people who lived there.
And that's what's missing, and that's what we're hoping to bridge, is that Greece is a theatre of war where the military history and the civilian history is very blurred. And our account as Greek Australians, being raised on our grandparents' stories, is very different to the military history. It's anecdotal. And then when you look at the history records, that's when you realise that actually happened. But that bridge hasn't been captured yet. And Kate really has made that bridge of military history and what we thought was anecdotal stories from our grandparents. Even, little, in this church, this icon survived as a miracle. We've got military history of that church being bombed, but nothing happened.
Yeah.
And, where we can now be cynical and say, yeah, whatever, okay. We've actually got military history that they kept bombing it and that church didn't, I'm just pulling an example, but there's all these,
I love that story.
Okay, there's all these stories.
Can I tell you that, the story of the cathedral in Heraklion and the Germans who were ordered to bomb it, and then every time they flew over it, their planes wouldn't actually open, they couldn't drop a bomb on it. I actually found that in a German memoir, not in a Greek one, and not in an Anzac one. And that was exactly the type of story I was searching for.
I just got chills.
Yeah.
Seriously.
So you're saying the Germans had to blow up a particular church?
Yeah.
And how many attempts do you know they had?
In the memoir that I read, that they were ordered to blow up the cathedral to break the Greek spirit. And the captain, or, the pilot in the Luftwaffe, he threw over it 3 times, and 3 times his flaps weren't open, so the bomb simply would not drop out. And then after that, he refused to try anymore, and so did everyone else. And so the cathedral stood unbroken. I just love that story so much.
Wow.
What do you think of that one? Have you heard that one before?
No, never. This is what I love about it. So I'm sure you probably got more stories than what Greeks would know.
And the dark side of that is we heard horrendous stories of reprisals that were not documented from the Greek side.
We have great stories just from Nick.
Yeah.
And his family.
And, mine the same. These stories have been passed from generation to generation in the hope that we never forget, not in order to punish, but to never allow it to happen again. I feel right now we're at a point where that's being diluted. We may go and lay wreaths at cenotaphs, but we're not quite understanding why.
Sure.
And it's stories that make relevance, like Kate has done in this story, that we start to understand because it's capturing even the darkest moments that we can't forget.
Do you think it's a Greek thing? Because I hear a lot of that. We don't really document it. We just move on with things. We don't dwell on what happened. Like I know in other cultures they dwell on what happened and they go on about it and make movies about it. But Greeks just move on, I guess. It may be my circle in my family.
Well, there is a sense that, that happened. It's
We
nothing.
move on.
It's nothing sort of thing.
I do think, this is my opinion only, and I'm happy to be judged on it, that with Greek World War II history, because the Civil War came in so quickly, we didn't really have the time to celebrate like France did. And there was a sense of embarrassment. There was a sense of moving on. But now, as we're third and fourth generations, people want to know what their grandparents did. It's a similar thing as Gallipoli.
I had a really interesting experience when I was in Crete, and that was when we were up in the mountains, and I was talking to a quite elderly man and asking him for his memories. And he said to me, you know what, we have been invaded and we have endured and we have fought and we have flung off their yoke, and then we are invaded and we fight and we endure and then we throw off their yoke. And then we are invaded again. And so in the incredibly long history of Crete, where they have been, because they are in such an incredibly powerful and strategic position in the midst of the Mediterranean, they have been invaded so many times that World War II was yet another story of struggle, endurance, and ultimate liberation. And, and this sense of endurance and strength is, I think, kind of bred into their cultural psyche. While for a country like Australia, which we had never been invaded, and then, we often talk about, Gallipoli as about this, part of our cultural myth. We only have this one, we have many, but in our cultural mythos, it stands up. Well, when you come from a culture that has fought and fought and fought for 100,000 years, perhaps it doesn't have quite the same
ferocity.
That's a great point.
Yeah, good point. Because Australia would have been their first sort of main battle they can celebrate, but Cretans, how far back do you want to go?
Yeah, exactly.
And which was the first one. So
You're talking about a people, and I mean we laugh about it, and people make jokes about it and all, but it's quite true. These are people who quite literally have guns under their pillows and in their glove boxes and knives, and these
they were
guys
digging them up. They were digging them up out of the their Turkish guns, ones they've used in the War of Independence previously. One of my favourite quotations comes from Winston Churchill, who during the war and after, when news came of the incredible resistance in Crete and elsewhere in Greece, he said, "No longer shall we say that heroes are like the Greeks."
Fight like Greeks.
Yeah, exactly. Now that we would say all Greeks are heroes. I might have that quite wrong, but I think you know what I'm saying.
It was in the intro. It was in the intro to a World War II episode, actually.
Yeah.
Something like that heroes fight like Greeks.
Yeah.
So Greeks don't fight like heroes, but heroes fight like Greeks.
Yeah. I found that incredibly moving.
And it is a famous quote, and it says something. For me, orchidea is something about the Greek spirit of saying no, or basically fuck you, basically.
Yeah.
I know we can swear on this.
You can.
Because
Feel free.
it's so intrinsic in our DNA that someone will tell us do it this way, even though we know it's right. We're like, no, we're not doing it that way because we're choosing not to do it that way.
Stubborn.
And then there's this uniqueness of, there's two things that make me incredibly proud. When I think of Ohi Day and the odds, and then I think of the rats of Tobruk.
Yeah.
You've captured both in the book. Is really, there's this uniqueness about Greece and Australia and about the underdog spirit.
Yeah.
And it's captured.
You know, my great uncle, who was the one that inspired me to write this book, he fought in Greece, he fought in Crete, and he was a rat of Tobruk.
Wow.
And so I was brought up on his stories in the same way that you've all been brought up on your grandparents' stories. And Crete is a place where your stories that you've been brought up by your grandparents meets the stories that I was brought up, told to me by my grandparents. And that's one of the reasons why it's I think, so incredibly beautiful and powerful, is it's a space in time where our histories touch.
Well,
and no other country do the histories touch like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's the second Anzac campaign. That's what it was.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, yeah, it is. That's what Nick Andrew-Tarkis kept on going on about.
Yeah.
How it is, and we should celebrate it. It is the second Anzac campaign.
I'm so glad you mentioned your uncle there because that's where we wanted to go. I think you had 4 uncles in total that fought there.
I had three great uncles and 1 grandfather.
Right.
So my grandfather never left Australia, but he was a cryptoanalyst that used to decode the secret messages sent by the Japanese.
Okay.
And so I draw upon his wartime experience a lot in the Crimson Thread as well. My great uncle Jerry was the one that fought in Greece and Crete,
right,
and then in Egypt. Another one of my uncles who was called Jack, and another one of my uncles who was called Stanley, they actually fought in the Middle East and then in Papua New Guinea.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's Jerry's last name?
Jerry Quirk.
Jerry Quirk. So where did he fight in Greece? Can you elaborate?
He was, part of the Australians that was sent to, resist against Mussolini, and then Hitler sent the Wehrmacht over the flanks of Mount Olympus. And so he was part of, I'm not quite sure what the battles were, though I've got them written down in my notebook. But he was part of that force that was standing against them and tried to hold them off while everyone else kind of retreated and then were evacuated out of Athens.
Right.
Perfect. And then he went back to Crete.
And then he went back to Crete, and he was there for 10 days. And I think that they got like an old fishing boat, from Athens to Crete. Wow. He fought during the Battle of Crete and then retreated over the White Mountains, and he was part of the rear guard. They were actively fighting the whole way back. The detail that my grandfather told me, that there's a couple of details that really kind of stuck in my mind and fired my imagination. One was that his boots were cut to pieces because the rocks of the White Mountains were so sharp, and he ended up having to do half of it in bare feet. Wow. So he was kind of slogging through rocks and snow with bare feet. And then they finally got to the beach. They were hiding in a cave and were almost caught, but the Germans went straight past because he was so skinny that he could slide into this cave, and so he wasn't caught. And then they were the last on the beach to be evacuated to Alexandria, and then a large force of British commandos shoved them out of the way and took their spot on the boats, and half of my great uncle's battalion was left on the beach.
Wow.
And when their commanding officer realised that that his men were being left behind, he dived overboard and swam back to the beach.
Wow.
And was taken prisoner with them. And those those few little details that were so real and so poignant really fascinated me. I still cry when I think of his commanding officer, diving over the board and swimming back, even though he knew he'd be taken prisoner. It was just so brave.
Yeah. And do you know what happened to that commanding officer?
Yeah. His name was Theo Walker. I wasn't told this by my grandfather. I was just told the story, but I found out. And he spent the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. So, but he
he
survived.
survived. Oh, wow.
Yeah, and came back. My great uncle, he was, taken back to Alexandria and ended up, fighting in Tobruk.
What a story.
Unbelievable. And I'm guessing you would have grown up hearing a lot of these stories. Was it part of the vernacular for your family?
Yeah, it was very much, so my parents were divorced when I was a teenager. So we spent a lot of summer holidays down with my father's parents. And, once they knew I was interested by the war, they told me many, many, many stories. The other one that really fascinated me was Jerry Quirk's brother, Stanley, who fought in Papua New Guinea. He had terrible post-traumatic stress syndrome. And one day he just got up, put on his hat, said, "I'm just going up the milk bar to get some bread," walked out the door, was never seen or heard of again.
Really?
Completely disappeared.
Kidding.
Yeah, and no one knew what happened to him.
No trace of him.
No trace of him. You couldn't do that nowadays, but this was in the late 40s.
Right.
And I always used to think, what harm was done to him? He had a wife and children and a home, and he'd left war and was living in peace. How awful was his experience that he could not bear that? So in a way, that story worked its way into the Crimson Thread for me as well, even though it was his brother who fought there, not himself.
Wow, so he never had peace mentally, I guess.
Yeah, that's right,
Yeah, so sorry, when you went back to Crete, did you actually find this cave that Jerry hid in?
We went looking for it, but, and we walked, through the gorge, we followed in their footsteps, and there are a few, there's so many caves.
Yeah.
There are so many caves. So I don't know which one, was actually his, but, we sort of explored quite a few. I went to the cave of Zeus.
Okay, wow.
Where Zeus was meant to be born.
No, where's that?
Oh my God! I think that's on top of one of the great mountains. Can't remember which one. And if I did remember it, I wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway.
Oh, that's okay. So what was it? Was he born there?
Zeus was born in Crete, and he was hidden there from his father, who wished to devour him. And
That sounds very Greek.
it sounds very Greek. And
Very Greek mythology.
yeah.
Good storytellers in
I
Crete.
thought I was dying.
And
we have some very strange stories.
I
reckon that's
love
where
the Greek
storytelling
myths.
came from.
I love the Greek myth. And
Couple
Zeus,
of aftershots of Tick with the R.
Yeah.
Zeus still sleeps on Crete. So there's a mountain behind the palace of Knossos, which has the profile of a man lying down. So you can see his forehead, his nose, and a beard, and then his kind of chest. And that is meant to be Zeus. And so the wine grown on Zeus's flank is meant to be particularly good.
Wow.
Hey, wow.
And I guess you've mentioned the caves because they're very prominent in your book, the caves, and that's sort of what I was. There's some particular stories of the caves where you talk about nymphs, which have got to be my favourite myths of all time. These nymphs that are so beautiful and alluring, yet can be
deadly.
so deadly. I love it. And you mentioned there's a particular one that you mentioned. I just found that because we all know when we travel through Greece, there's little alcoves and that, and the villagers have a story about it. It's not written anywhere. It's not sort of discussed anywhere. I know in my parts there's a lot of those little stories. Is that story of that particular cave, and is that something you discovered when you were on Crete, or is that something you researched?
No, I discovered that particular cave reading a book called The Bull of Minos, which is a history of the Palace of Knossos and Sir Arthur Evans, and also of Schliemann, the German archaeologist who discovered Troy. And so it's a book about archaeology, and it's a comparison of the lives of Schliemann and Evans. And it's written by a British archaeologist who sets out on a journey to go, like he walks in the footprints of Schliemann, then he walks in the footprints of Evans, and he was taken to that cave when he was at the Palace of Knossos. And quite a few of the details that I got, because he wrote his book in the 1950s, and I went to the palace, I went to the Villa Ariadne. I was given a private tour of it, but it doesn't have much remaining of what it was like in the 40s when it was the Nazi headquarters. So I had to rely on that book for quite a few interesting details about how the villa was furnished, for example, and what they had on the walls. And you know what I do is I read every single book I can find, and one book will give me one little detail that I like, and then I have to explore that and delve into it. And another book gives me just one other detail. And if I didn't read quite so widely, I wouldn't discover these tiny little hidden facts.
So how do you bring all of these things together? I've heard that you've got your notebooks. These are famous or infamous, I guess.
Yeah.
How does that process work for you?
Yeah, I like to keep a record of my creative processes, and so I write down any thought, idea, question. I keep kind of track of it. I mainly do this because nowadays everyone works on computers and everything's overwritten and deleted, and it looks like books are born, like, to use a Greek myth, analogy, spring fully formed from the writer's head, like Athena from the forehead of Zeus.
Yeah.
But they don't. It's like a highly delicate process of bringing all sorts of things in and making a very beautiful and intricate mosaic floor, 1,000 tiny little pieces. And so I like to keep a record of that. The other reason is because human memory is fallible, and my books tend to be, quite complex and are drawing upon all different kinds of sources. So if I wasn't really meticulous about keeping records of my research and so forth, it'd be really easy to forget or get in a muddle or make mistakes, and I wouldn't want to do that.
How would you map all of these things? Is it a case of you're creating a timeline ahead of time and just mapping these points out?
So I keep quite intricate timelines, and particularly when it comes to something as complex as the Battle of Crete, where there were 1,000 small, encounters and battles and skirmishes and defeats and so forth. I also keep really good records of the people who were there. So for example, Patrick Leigh Fermor, the British travel writer, he fought in the Battle of Crete and then he came back as an SOE agent. So I read all of his books. Ian Fleming's brother was there, Peter Fleming was there, Evelyn Waugh was there, Lawrence Durrell was there.
So Ian Fleming, that was the guy that wrote 007.
Yeah.
Wow. James Bond.
And he apparently named James Bond after an Australian soldier whose name was Rodney Bond, who managed to escape Athens by navigating across the Mediterranean with the Children's Atlas of the Mediterranean and the stars.
Wow.
So I tell that story in the book as well.
Does that mean we can claim James Bond now?
Okay.
100%.
I think
100%.
we can now claim officially James Bond.
Yeah.
Put that on the Gus. It's all Greek checklist there.
Just on James Bond, I found out not long ago. We are claiming him, by the way. That's it. It's done. It's
done.
We have. It's done.
Did you know? So
3 of
Ian
us have
Fleming-
voted him in.
Yeah.
So
There's a panel.
It's official because it's been done by Uzo Talk.
Exactly.
Done.
Exactly.
So
There's
4
no
votes.
There's
Raise
no
your,
higher
raise your
power.
hand. Yep, we got 4 votes.
That's
This
it.
is
Greek.
a
Yay.
Greek vote. We're all presidents. Quorum done.
Democracy in action.
That's it. I was going to say, so I was reading somewhere. Oh, here you go, mate. Yeah. We're just refilling. Sorry. I read that Ian Fleming actually. That's it. The bottle's empty. You want me to try ringing it out? Okay. Sorry. Ian Fleming actually based the character on his cousin, I think it was, who was Christopher Lee, the actor Christopher Lee, who later appeared as Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun.
I've never heard that.
I read that somewhere. I don't know if it's true or not.
Well, I know that Roald Dahl.
He was a bomber.
He was in Greece.
Yes.
And there's a beautiful book about that.
He's written his autobiography about it, which I did read as well. Yeah, so I just, it was incredible. There was like a couple of weeks when all the greatest writers in the world at that time, all the greatest male writers anyway, were centred upon Greece and Crete. And then they all wrote, they either, wrote fictionalised versions of it, like Evelyn Waugh in Sword of Honour, or they wrote their memoirs of it, or they wrote letters. And, so I just was like, tirelessly reading everything that I could find to see, what they would say privately that they might not say publicly.
Just think about that. Evelyn Waugh, Roald Dahl. Who were the other? Sorry, who were the other ones?
Darrell.
Jeez.
Lawrence Darrell.
Ian.
Unbelievable.
Peter Fleming.
Peter Fleming.
Yeah. James Bond.
Yeah.
But
Unbelievable.
you know what I find unbelievable is that when you mention this to Greek Australians, they have no idea.
Yeah.
And that's the tragedy for me. That's the Greek tragedy for me, that our culture inspires so much, and and capturing that.
Well, why do you think it is? I mean, we've heard about people like Lord Byron, for example, going to Greece. Even in my own family, the property that my family has in Corfu, Edward Lear lived and drew on that property. Why do you think you like Edward Lear?
I like Corfu.
Oh, there you go. So why do you think it is that these primarily British writers used to go to Greece and were so inspired by it?
Well, it's because they were all educated in the classics. So most of them were university educated, Oxford or Cambridge. Most of them, if you wanted to be a writer, you studied the classics. And so they were reading, Homer. They were reading, the Greek playwrights. They were, many of them were taught ancient Greek. And, not just university, but right through the school system as well, the public school system. And so they were deeply, deeply steeped in the history and mythology of Greece. And to them, it was like, this ideal of this land where everything was larger than life, where there was courage, where there was struggle, where there was triumph, a place where the gods still lived. England at that time was pretty dreary. And I don't mean just in its climate.
Because they all used to go to Greece for the weather,
they
really.
They went to
still
Greece.
do.
The climate.
They went to Greece not just for the beautiful sunshine and the fact that they could actually swim in the waters there, unlike if you were trying to...
The Thames.
Yeah, exactly. They were going there because of the spirit of the land and this sense of...
The zest for life.
I have my character Jack, who is, the hero of my book, the male, main male character. When he's sailing into Athens, he thinks this is where, the theatre was invented.
Yeah.
This is where myth was invented. This was where, Sophocles drank hemlock. This is where, this is the cornerstone of Western civilization. And all that we have learnt from it about democracy, about art, about theatre, about tragedy. Yeah. They were so deeply steeped in the classic tradition that it formed them, it shaped them, and they longed for it. And that, I think, is, you really need to understand that to understand why they all were so eager to go back and fight there. Yeah. Because it meant so much to their imaginations.
And over many generations, many centuries. Like Lord Byron is buried in, I think, Mesologia, I think
that's where he died,
Yeah, and these are, an honorary Greek. All of these people became Philhellenes in some sense.
Yeah, true. And you said there's more statues of him in Greece than in England.
There is.
In London, yeah.
So I just want to then ask, if we're looking at World War II and you've done that historical research and those historical accounts, how did you find that they connected with the oral histories you found in Greece? Did they connect, or was it, again, this incredible picture of heroism that happened, but the truth that of actually happened was different?
So, one of the things that I need to do as part of my research is that when I'm told a piece of family history, and an oral story, I take note of it, but I need to go back and interrogate it, and make sure that I can't simply repeat the story that I'm told. I need to find historical evidence of it,
like a fact check.
Yeah, I have to do my fact checking, and that can sometimes be hard, and that actually took quite a lot of time. But it's important for me to know that anyone who reads one of my books knows that I'm not simply repeating stories that have no basis in fact. I always say there's a covenant of trust between a writer and a reader, and when people come to my books, they need to know that I am honouring the truth and that I've done my research.
Yep.
And the book would be much easier to write if I didn't. But the truth is so powerful, so dramatic, and so incredible. I don't need to embellish it, but I do need to make sure that it's deeply rooted in the historical record as well.
Is there any examples of that you were told a story?
She's doing your work for you, mate.
I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Yeah. So
Beautiful.
The German commander in the latter half of the occupation is a guy called Müller. And he was called the Butcher of Crete because he was responsible.
That's the guy they tried to capture, didn't they?
Yeah, they tried to capture him, but they couldn't get him
because he moved on, and they grabbed his replacement.
He'd moved to Henia, and so that they took his replacement.
Actually, sorry, tell us a story about Müller.
Yeah, but Müller, he went on this rampage of death and revenge in his final weeks in Crete. And I was told this appalling story about how there was this prison halfway between Retimo and Hania, and he ordered his men to drag out, I think, 100 prisoners at random, and then just behead them with an axe. For absolutely no reason except that he was angry because he was being, the Germans were losing the war. And this story, I just haunted my imagination because, it was so cruel and it was so haphazard, and he left the next day. So he didn't have to do it.
Yeah.
He was being flown back to Germany. And I was told this story, but I couldn't find any evidence of it. But then I'm, kind of digging around, and I find a newspaper account that was written in Greek that mentioned the final atrocity at this prison, and with the thanks of Google Translate, I was able to read it, and it just, this newspaper account described exactly what I'd been told, and so I knew I could use it. I like to have 3 pieces of evidence, and so oral history counts as one, and the newspaper account, and then once I had that, I was able to do some more digging.
What's the third one? So oral, written?
Yeah, so I really love to read the work of academics and historians, and so I was able to find another piece of evidence in an academic article about what was happening in the final stages of the war. Again, it was only a small line or 2, but it confirmed the oral story that I'd been told.
Wow. I guess that's why the Cretans wanted to capture Müller after what he did, I guess.
Oh, he was a terrible man.
Yeah.
And can you give us any other examples? They're really good stories.
One of the stories that I was told when I was in Crete, which completely horrified me and which I actually didn't believe could be true, was a man told me that his grandmother had been... Her granddaughters were fighting for the resistance, and she hid them in her cellar, and then had put furniture over it. And then the Nazis came in search of these 2 young women, and the grandmother pretended that she didn't know where they were.
Do we know how old they were, these young women?
I don't know, but I think they must have been quite young, maybe 17, 18 or 19.
Okay.
And they set the grandmother on fire.
Wow.
And I just could not believe that was true. And so I had to, go in search. And I did find other incidences of that happening. So this grandmother burnt to death rather than... And the 2 young women in the cellar being able to hear what was going on.
Wow.
But couldn't get out because the furniture had been moved over the cellar. Anyway, it was an
And those young
astonishing
girls
story.
survived, obviously.
Yeah. Because it was one of their sons who told me the story.
I mean, we're cringing now. This isn't the first time, obviously, that we've heard stories like this. And Nick, I understand that you've got a story from your parts in Ipiro. Kate, you mentioned the word haphazard. That example that you'd given me previously of, lining up a whole group of men in retaliation for something that they had done in the resistance.
So I heard it from from my uncle that fought in World War II. He was a resistance fighter and so forth. And it was they call it the Sarandainya Paramithya, so the 49 from Paramithya. So there was a group, again, I heard this story from many sources, but my grandmother got caught by the Germans, my mother's older cousins, and there's a few others, so essentially all my ancestors, a lot of my relatives, and they made them build a road. So all the women got caught because the men were in the mountains fighting, and the women were building this road. And my grandmother, the one that I spoke to, she said all the Andates came out from the woods, and they basically tried to take out these Germans, and there was 7 of them, and one had a gun pointed at my grandma, and they were saying, "Run to the mountains, run to the mountains." She said, "I can't," and she didn't want to move because the German was saying, "If you move, I'll shoot you." Another guy popped up from behind the rock and shot him. So all the women escaped. So 7 Germans died. And the word got around was the people that did that raid were from this village called Paramithya. So the Germans sent in, I think it was a platoon, like tanks and hundreds of soldiers. And there was, again, the story was there was a traitor, a Greek traitor, that identified, basically went through the village, and they said, well, this house has got 2 sons.
An informant.
This house has got a brother and 2 sons. This house has got 2 brothers. They had 50 males from that village lined up. I made him dig a massive trench. And my uncle was telling me the story, and he wasn't just telling me the story, we're actually walking the path. So as we're walking, in the village, he goes, there was 50 lined up, and he goes, there was a 16-year-old boy who used to do a favour for the commandant, get him fresh bread every morning. So he said, "You can go." And then they did a massive speech, and they said, any German that dies will kill 7 Greeks. So they had the tanks roar through this town, and they got a machine gun, and they actually assassinated the 49, chucked him in the trench, and he just slaughtered them. And then as we walked, he goes to me, I go, where were they all buried? And he goes, "Look behind you." And I looked behind me, and there was the tomb, and this was the spot where they all died. And I could see all their names, and I said, do you know them? And he goes, "Nick, I know all of them." She said, "That's my best friend, that's his brother, that's his sons, that's his uncles," and nearly all the names are the same. So just wiped out a whole a whole race of people,
Generations of people. And we hear the numbers after the war equate to about 10% of the Greek male population.
Yeah. But the story doesn't finish there, because I said to him, "What happened to the guy that dobbed you all in?" I said, we found him, and we hunted him, and we got him. We took him into the woods, and we put him on trial. I said, "Well, what did you say?" And he goes, "Well, keep on walking." So we kept on walking up this slope now. And he goes, I go, "What did you do?" And he goes, "Well, we asked him questions. Did they have a gun to your head? Did they terrorise your kids? Did they do something to, did they threaten you?" And the way he told his story and the evidence they gave was just out of pure greed. He would have been in charge of this whole municipality if when the Germans took over. So it was just out of pure greed. So and then we kept on walking, and then we stopped, and I saw him ruffling, through trees and scrub. I go, "What are you looking for?" And he goes, "Hang on one sec." And he found here it is. I go, "What was it?" And he goes, "About here, I can see there's seedlings of a fig tree." He goes, "There was a fig tree right at this spot." He goes, near where they all got assassinated. And he goes, "We tied him to the tree, and we shot him." And he goes, the other part of the story is he had a wife and a son, or a daughter. I can't remember what it was. He had a wife and a kid. And he goes, and the wife and the kids still live in the village today. He goes, but no one mentions it. No one talks bad about those people because they're innocent victims. And he goes, they're our people. And he goes, and they've lived a normal life. And I don't think the kid ever knew. Yeah. Yeah, and they said, so they're one of us, and no one ever bags them. If everyone does, the villagers will get behind the person that teases them. But they never knew. So they lived part of the community, and that was the story. But that story, it sort of just come and went.
It just brings it so close, doesn't it? It makes it so real. Yeah. So often we think of these, these great struggles of the past as being all I don't know, generals and dates and places. But when you hear a story like that, you realise that these were real people who were, facing unimaginable hardship and struggle and sorrow and really difficult choices.
He showed me photos as well, and he had a photo of him in a German outfit. I said, where did you get that from? He goes, we ambushed them down here in the ravine up near wherever it was. And he goes, and we put his outfit on. I said, well, do you have it? And he goes, no, I chucked it out. I said, Uncle, I would have loved all that. He goes, I didn't realise you liked all that. And then he found underneath there was a tap where dripping water and had a little bowl. I go, what's that? Or he went up and he goes, do you want this? And he dug it out of the dirt, and it was a World War II helmet. And I said, yes, definitely. So he cleaned it up and painted it. So I've got it upstairs.
I have to say, when I was in Crete, when I was telling you about the old man that I was talking to up in the mountains, they showed me how they had used a German helmet as a pot plant. Yeah. They had a plant because, and they said, look, everyone was so poor that if you found something, you just used it.
Yeah, definitely.
It was this,
And I guess you've really touched on something, and Kate, you've mentioned it, because that's the civilian side of the story of the Greek theatre of war, is the reprisals.
Yep.
Yeah, they were savage.
Hiding the Anzacs, and then whole villages being massacred, or there was an ambush by the Andartes, or the resistance. And I've grown up with those stories as well, my dad's villages, and I feel that in the northern Greece as well, they haven't been told yet properly, and they were horrendous. The type of stuff,
there's tons of them,
horror stories that you really, they're not bedtime stories, because you're right, they're real, they're in fact, and simply because they've come from our grandparents doesn't mean they're not real.
Yeah.
I think it's really, really important that we listen to these stories and we record them before they're all lost. These events are just on the edge of living memory now. And, one of the reasons why I think World War II continues to fascinate and haunt us is because these are our grandparents and our great aunts and great uncles who lived and suffered through this. And as they begin to die, their stories are lost with them. And for many of them, they simply were unable to tell their stories because the atrocities were so dreadful that they needed to forget. And I don't think we've really talked about that, about how incredibly difficult it would be to tell these stories when they were still so raw in your memory. And that is why I think it's so important that we listen to the stories of our grandparents, we record them, and we honour them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And look, I think you've managed to capture that, that thing about the reprisals, but equally, I think it's somewhat balanced. Crimson Thread is balanced in the sense that, there is one scene, and spoilers, but, but not really. It's a small thing. But it was quite powerful for me to read that part about, the German saying to, the German soldiers saying to Jack and Alenko, I have brothers too. That's something that we don't really see a lot of, in a lot of these accounts, whether it be film or whatnot. Seeing some humanity in that side of it.
To me, it was really, really important to show that there were, yes, indeed, of course, there were, Germans who were very brutal and cruel and wrong, but there were many others who, the story of the Germans in Crete is very tragic as well. One German mother lost all three of her sons, aged 17, 19 and 21, on the same day. And that there were also so many Greeks who showed such courage and such, resilience, but they were collaborators and traitors amongst them. And amongst the Anzac soldiers, there were those who were incredibly, brave and good-hearted, but there were those that didn't behave that well either. I think it's better to understand the nuances and the fact that, we aren't talking about absolute evil and absolute good here. We're talking about humans in all of their frailties and flaws and weaknesses. And so I did try as much as possible to be fair
Yeah.
in the way that I showed
And
it.
it wasn't like in an office environment. This is war. This is gun. People are dying. The stuff that you're seeing.
Yeah, you're not having a group meeting.
Exactly.
No, at
There's
one
not-
point, Jack says to his best friends, you need to be careful that when you're fighting monsters, you don't turn into a monster yourself. And in a war so in the Crimson Thread, I draw upon the Minotaur and the Labyrinth myth in what I like to call a metaphorical way. So I don't actually have a labyrinth or a bull-headed man in the book, but the Minotaur is a metaphor for the worst of humans' evil nature, and that to me is war. It's war that turns men into monsters. It's the greed and the hunger for power and the desire to dominate and rule which leads people to make war, and the incredible damage and harm that it causes. I think of the poor people in the Ukraine now who are suffering from that in exactly the same way now, and we can't afford to forget. We need to remember and try and stop these atrocities happening ever again. And that's why we have to listen and tell the stories of the past.
I can't help but ask the question, when it comes to that explanation you've just given, is that sort of intellectual framework around this is the message of what I'm trying to convey, this is what it's rooted in, is that something that you planned ahead of time and worked to, or did it just come out that way?
No, it was always, it's always part of the plan. So when you're writing a novel like this, you think very deeply about what it is that you're trying to do and what you want. On the one hand, you want the story to be a really compelling page turner that you can't stop reading, that is so full of drama and suspense and action that it's utterly compelling. But on the other hand, you want it to have a deeper level of meaning that people think about and remember, and that perhaps changes them in some way.
Sure.
Because that's when it's really doing its work.
Sorry, to get back on it, did you hear any stories about the paratroopers in Germany? I'm sure you would have spoken to some locals, because I know it was an atrocity for the Germans. What were some of the stories you heard amongst the elders you spoke to?
I didn't actually hear any stories of the paratroopers while I was in Crete, but I did go to the museum in both Hania, I'm not sure if I'm saying that, Hania?
That's right.
Hania, and another one in Heraklion, and they had amazing exhibitions where they had interviews that I listened to or read, and I bought a few of their books that were very, very... I'm very grateful for this. Greek on one page and English on the other page. And so I was able to read, beautiful things like, the letters that, Greek men wrote to their wives and children before they were to be executed. And so those museum exhibitions were incredibly useful to me. One of the things that really, really struck me powerfully was I went to the Folklore Museum in Retimo, and they had all this incredible embroidery by Cretan women, and then they had embroidery of paratroopers.
Wow.
Floating down, and men and women running to fight them with, knives. And, I found that so unbelievably poignant that, many of these young women would have been illiterate or only semi-literate, particularly if they were coming down from the mountains, and so they sewed their stories rather than wrote them down, and
as part of their dowry.
Many of them had to cut up their dowries for bandages.
That was one of the most that was the most heartbreaking moments in the book for me. Knowing the importance of that, particularly in that period of time. To think this is potentially a lifetime's worth of work. Something that the girl's grandmother would have potentially contributed to, which is quite common, and being so selfless to say, cut it up and help these people.
Well, that actually happened. I drew upon that. I gave it to my fictional heroine, Alenka, but the act of cutting up their dowry to make bandages is in the historical record. And the other one that really broke my heart was the old woman, I made it Alenka's mother, but this truly happened, who lit candles to honour the fallen Germans as well. And as a result, the palace, the village of Knossos did not have the same reprisals because the Germans saw the candles had been lit along the mass graves.
Right.
And so that village was spared.
Wow.
And I found that really powerful, and they said, why did you light the candles, to the, to the winged devils? And the old woman said, because they too are someone's sons.
Yeah.
I mean, just...
It's funny that you mentioned those moments of humanity, because my grandmother had told me a story. My mum was 2.5 and my uncle was about 6 months old. She was a widow, and they hid in a monastery up in the mountains for pretty much 4 years. Somehow they captured a German soldier, and even my mum, as young as she has, all I remember is this vision of a very blonde person, incredibly blonde, and they had him in that monastery, sort of in the in the middle of the monastery, tied up.
Yep.
And the women were saying, we can't execute him, that's someone's son, and maybe our sons are somewhere captured. And they were having this debate all night. When they woke, now the men were like, but it's going to give away where we're hiding. It was a huge resistance part. It was in the passes of Mount Olympus, so it was a really big gun trafficking pass through there. So they woke in the morning. I think the men took the decision upon themselves, but he was gone. But my grandma did mention the story that the women were like, he's someone's son, and that really struck me, that scene, because I remember her words saying that. And again, we see in war, and I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine, you see these mothers carrying children, and they carry them for hope. You see these women, they're carrying the future that we can do better, and they put themselves through so much in those wars to just get those children to survive, because, and a lot of them are single mothers, and they're carrying those children that we can do better. These children represent hope that humanity can do better.
And we can, we absolutely can, but we can't forget the stories of the past, and we can't allow ourselves to think it doesn't matter, because it does.
Do you think people forget over time?
Look,
because it seems like wars happen more often than not.
We were talking before about why it was that the Greek people haven't been as quick to tell the stories of their hardships and their battles in the same way that perhaps other cultures have. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think part of it is simply that all their energies had to go on surviving and then rebuilding, and that when all your energies are going on simply staying alive, it's best to keep moving forward. I think it's a time now to make sure that these stories are remembered and are recorded, and that it's the younger generation that needs to learn from them.
With all your research and all your discussions, what would be your most vivid one that still carries you today?
There was part of the problem for me is that there were so many amazing stories and I couldn't include them all. I had to pick and choose. There's a couple that I remember really, really struck me. One was the story of the women of Hania who defended their city for days, holding the Germans off, and then the Germans were desperate for thirst, because all their wells and streams were being guarded.
So and defended with rifles and
they
weapons.
were. They were actually lying as snipers and were simply shooting.
Wow.
With rifles,
This was the women of Hania.
Yeah.
Wow.
This was the women of Hania because there was no men there to help them. And then they captured a young German soldier who was trying to sneak through to get water. And they stripped him of his uniform and his boots and his weapons.
Really?
They did not kill him. They sent him back and with a message for his commander that basically said something along the lines of, we, the women of Hania, will defend our town to the death, and if you come here again, we will eat your livers.
Wow.
That sounds slightly Cretan.
I know.
That's very Cretan.
Have you ever heard that story before?
No.
Because we hear of the women of Messalongi.
Yeah.
Is that just mind-blowing?
It is, 100%.
I love that story.
That's why I don't want to let you go, Kay. I want to hear more of these stories.
Well, let me tell you, just a few weeks ago, we had Commodore James Stavridis from the Royal Australian Navy here. The reason I'm mentioning him is that Greece has a very rich history of women participating in, not in an official capacity in history, in the organised military, but someone like Bouboulina, the first Greek admiral, effectively.
I read all about her. She's one of my heroine Alenka's, heroes. Yeah.
Figures like that. This is the first female admiral in history. Then you've got women like the ones that you've just spoken about in terms of the resistance fighters. Did you meet any of these women or the offspring of them?
I met offspring of them because everyone had a story. And once they heard that I was Australian, many of them were telling me stories about how their mothers or their grandmothers or their aunts had hidden an Australian or New Zealand soldier. Because, there were several thousand Anzacs who were hidden which is why caves are quite prevalent in my book, because they were hidden in cellars and old churches and in caves and in kind of, hidden places. And, they gave, quite a few of the details in the book come from those stories they told me. One told me how the soldier was hidden in the cellar and they had the rug over it and the table, and then they would sit there and eat, and the Germans would come in and be searching, and they would be sitting at their table, just like we are now, but the Anzac is actually hidden.
Wow.
Underneath the table.
Underneath the rug, underneath the table. And they had to practice. They could get the table and the rug and the table set in like 10 seconds flat.
Yeah.
And then they would have to wait before they could let him out. Just little details like that I found really, really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you have any more? Great story.
Nick's digging deeper and deeper.
I know. I love all this because, we talk about, heroine women. Like, I've always grown up with that. Like, we're from the mountains of Greece, and all my ancestors, all the women were essentially supplying all the ammunition to the men on the front line. And what they had to endure to go through the mountains and so carrying ammunition, weapons on their backs. It's mind-boggling. Like, not even the best athletes can even do that if you see some of these mountains and so forth. But
so one of the eeriest stories that I have is that, when I decided I was going to, write this book, I planned out this story of this young Cretan woman, Alenka, who saves the life of 2 Anzac soldiers and, ends up, working for the Wehrmacht, who was centred at the Villa Ariadne and was smuggling out messages to them. And then she falls in love and marries, one of the Allied agents who she was working with. And so I was reading all these memoirs about Greek women who married Australian or British or New Zealand stories. But I was quite a long way into my research when I realised that I was actually telling a true story, and that is the story of Philia Akumianakis, which I can't pronounce.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me too.
Yeah. So her brother Mickey was the head of the SOE. He was the head of the Greek arm of it, and they lived next door to the Villa Ariadne, and they could spy on the movements of the Greek troops, from the attic of their house. Wow. And it was Mickey and Philia who were instrumental in setting up the kidnap of General Crepe that we were talking about before.
Crepe,
with Patrick Lee Firma, which is fantastic boys on adventure.
Yeah. Henrik Crepe.
That's right. Yeah. And so I have Philia being Alenka's best friend, living next door to her. But it was only when I got in contact with her son, and he told me her story and gave me all these details about what she'd done in the war, that I realised that all that I'd given Alenka as being this, incredibly brave young woman who infiltrates the Wehrmacht and works for the resistance right under the noses of the Germans, that was actually a true life story.
Wow.
So I acknowledge that in my author's note and say, even though my story is fictional, it was inspired by the true story of the women of the resistance, and in particular, most eerily, Philia, who is a character in my book. Wow. And I did not know it when I was writing it.
Unbelievable.
Based on true events.
Yeah. Well, just on that, I'm putting my writer's hat on now. You have characters like Patrick Leigh Fermor in the story. How does one go about putting words into the mouth of someone who is a historical figure? Obviously, he's got interactions with Jack and a number of other people. How do you go about that in a respectful way?
It's a question I get asked all the time. So, we build character in exactly the same way, regardless of whether they are fictional or whether they really did once live. It's just much easier with someone like Patrick Leigh Fermor, because he wrote extensively about his experiences in Crete and with the SOE, and wherever possible, I simply put his own words into his mouth.
Sure.
So there's a fantastic scene where he's in an old ruin, and he's talking to the local people of Knossos, and he has this kind of running joke about the black propaganda he's doing with the Germans, where he's sticking up notices with daggers going, "You are going to die, this is what we're going to do to you, signed black someone or other." And then the very dour resistance leader goes, "Who is this man? I do not know this man." And Patrick Leigh Fermor goes, "Well, I made him up, but he was too good not to make up." So this is actually from a diary entry of his, and I've just lifted it and animated it, if you like. So the actual words are Patrick Leigh Fermor's.
Okay.
And you can imagine that, right?
Yeah,
I made him up.
100%.
How good is this character? How can I not make him up?
Make him real.
And there's another anecdote which was actually written by a young man who was in the Cretan resistance, who wrote his memoirs, and he wrote a memoir about how he worked with Patrick Leigh Fermor, and he was talking about how they were going into Heraklion, and Patrick Leigh Fermor was dressed in Cretan traditional dress, so the billowing breeches, the knee-high boots, the sash, and the black scarf. And then he speaks Greek, but he speaks the Greek of Oxford, not the Greek of Crete.
Yep.
And he is stopped by a German, very suspiciously, because he was 6'1", blonde and blue-eyed, all dressed up as a Cretan. And Paddy, says in his Oxford accented, Greek, he says, "Here, take my scarf. It looks good on you," and wraps it around and has a joke. And then the German sentry just laughs and lets him through, because he can't believe that anyone would be so bold and so cheeky and so have such bravado.
Just the
I love
confidence.
that's right. I mean, can you imagine? So that's that kind of story. So again, I'm finding one anecdote about Patrick Leigh Fermor in a memoir of a young Greek resistance fighter, another detail in the letter he wrote to the girl he was having an affair with back in Egypt, another detail in his account of the kidnapping of General Crepe.
Crepe, I think is the way.
Crepe, yeah. Anyway, and that's what I do, and then I just weave them all together, and then I try and make it feel like you're actually there,
So would you touch a character that you wouldn't have any indication of what they had said or anything like that?
Well, I'm writing fiction.
Yeah.
I'm a novelist, and so it's a work of imagination. So I have absolutely no problem in putting thoughts inside people's heads or words inside people's mouths. But the trick is to make it feel real.
Yeah.
The reader has to believe, has to feel as if they're there. And so, everyone has to have, I think a great deal about, what people want, what they fear, how they would speak, any weird mannerisms they would have, what kind of makes them come to life on the page is part of the craft of being a novelist.
Yeah. Look, I think we're sort of getting towards the end of this discussion, but we could talk forever about this. Honestly,
definitely.
I can tell Nick's got 1,000 questions. You can see it, but
don't let me take over, Nick.
I think you're going to be a regular host on here.
You should be, absolutely.
Very well. I like your
Well, there was one other character, was Reginald Saunders.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that really moved me.
Yeah, so Reg Saunders is an Indigenous soldier who signed up. He actually signed up with his AFL club down in Victoria. I really badly wanted to have him as a character in the book, and I read as much as I could find about him and, watch a documentary on him. He makes a cameo appearance. He isn't one of the major characters. But I just love the fact that, because he was, had dark hair and skin and eyes, and he was used to, passing, he lived in the Cretan mountains for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Incredible.
It's an unbelievable story.
He learnt Greek and, made many, many friends here and went on to be the first Indigenous officer in the Australian Army.
Yeah.
And I don't think he could even vote in Australia. I think that was the rule, but he ended up being...
second-class citizen when he came back.
Yeah.
But the good thing is, I hear they're going to make a metro station named after him in Pitt Street.
Yep.
I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. So we're talking about that. You're right, in the World War II episode with Nick mentioned him as well. So,
absolutely.
And after we did that episode, it came up in the news, and I said, "Hey Nick, do you see this? Looks like they're asking for petitions for naming," and this guy's name popped up. So I think it got over the line. So
that is just so fantastic. It was just really important to me that I included him and that he had a chance to be part of the book when I was writing about the experience of Australian soldiers in Crete during the war. It just seemed important to me to include him. Yeah.
But I want to talk about Greek mythology and legend in popular culture. From Hollywood, comic book writers, publishers and artists, authors like yourself, screenwriters, all of them seem to borrow, reimagine or reappropriate, at the very least be inspired by ancient Greek storytelling. Why do you think that is? And do you think it's because these are archetypal stories now, or does it go even deeper than that?
It's a really interesting question, I think. I think it's got something to do with what we were talking about before, with the young British officers who'd been so deeply steeped in Greek, history, myth and culture. And so, the stories that we hear or read or see or experience help shape our psyche.
Sure.
They help make us who we are. I think it's because they're such big stories, and I think it's because, myth works in more than one way. On the one hand, they're really engaging stories of, heroism and battles and triumph, but they carry sacred meaning as well.
Sure.
The Greek myths are deeply embedded in ancient, ritual and rites and beliefs. And they carry, I think, encoded messages of wisdom. And that's what draws me to them. You mentioned before, I have a doctorate in fairy tale studies. You could call it mythic studies, because I work with myth as much as I do with fairy tales. What these stories do is they're a way of passing down in secret code lessons on how to live well, lessons on how to survive, and lessons to teach us how to be better humans. So in many of these stories, and not in all stories, but in many stories, if you are clever enough, or if you are brave enough, or if you are kind enough, or if you are daring enough, you will prevail. So Theseus is often misrepresented. In the original tales, he was small and slight, and yet he learnt how to fight, and because he was so bold and because he was clever, he prevailed. So he's not like Hercules, who was all like rippling muscles and had great strength. He was small and slight. He wasn't very strong, but he was quick and clever, and that's why he prevailed. So I do think that each new generation discovers the stories that it needs to teach them how to be wise. And the stories that survive are the ones that best teach those lessons.
It's interesting because there's no doubt that a lot of these stories are didactic, but especially nowadays, whether it comes from a religion or something like that, the characters are generally very pure or of a higher power. It's interesting to me because these characters, whether they're the heroes or whatever, they're us. They're just people. They're not necessarily gods. They're not anyone. Or if they are gods, they tend to have the same
they're
foibles.
very human, aren't they?
Exactly.
They've
They're
got
jealous.
flaws and frailties, and even the Greek gods are very, very human. They don't have this idea of this, kind of higher, pure thing.
Yep.
They're living and lusting and fighting and getting cranky,
Yep.
and because I think it's their humanity, their humanness that makes these stories so appealing, because we can recognise ourselves in them.
Yeah.
Well, when we have these, perfect, untouchable beings, well, we really can't project ourselves into them in the same way.
Absolutely. Wow.
And do you think 28 Oktobrio in 5,000 years will be, one of these myths of...
It's a great question.
Because I was listening to the music of Sofia Vembo, and, she mentions, that we should never forget this heroic act. Stigmesia ta nea pedia ta ingonia. So for our young children and our grandchildren, the heroism of gratisan prosto doce towards the Italian, mia hufta aplifandari, a handful of just average soldiers held them back. This is part of that myth legend, and this is why the 28th of October is so... and she mentions, we need to keep retelling this story of this act, of what happened. And I think this is part of our culture and traditions of retelling and keeping these stories alive, because eventually they become the myths of
true.
and legends.
Maybe
Great
that's
point.
how the Iliad and the Odyssey came about.
Absolutely.
Over the years, people slightly change some of the stories and... But great point.
I think that we have discovered that oral history actually is remarkably stable. That, over time, aspects of it change, but it still carries a seed of truth within it.
Yeah.
And so, yes, absolutely. I think that in 5,000 years, our descendants will be remembering the stories that we tell now, which is why we should choose the stories that we tell wisely.
And choose to tell them well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We'll have
And
the
that's incumbent on
advantage
us
now, because we've got books and videos on it.
and podcasts.
And we've got, I was going to say, and we've got Uzo Talk.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you mentioned it.
Yeah.
Maybe someday in the future there'll be a child digging through an old ruin, and they'll come across this record and they'll go, "What is this?"
An external hard drive.
An external hard drive.
USB.
Amongst one of many bottles of Uzo and...
I was going to say,
People
what's that going to say about us in archaeology, Nick?
It'll be a USB, Uzo bottle floating in the ocean.
Yeah.
Walk on it.
Exactly.
Kids will be looking at it going, who are these pissheads? What's going on?
Who are these clowns? Yeah, what are they talking about?
Oh, dear. Well, look, I mean, at the time of recording, Kate, you're going to be speaking this Sunday, I believe it is, in Marrickville for the 28th of October celebrations or commemorations, rather, in Marrickville. The Prime Minister's going to be there. There's going to be a whole bunch of dignitaries there.
And this is a collaboration that I should mention, Inner West Council, Sydney University, and this is the start of a bigger research project of collecting these stories, recording them. And the fact that it's a collaboration of these external institutions like the Institute and Sydney University means that all of a sudden we are trying to capture this very unique crossroad of Australian and Greek history with the 28th of October. And it's just so important and so unique to Greek Australians, so unique.
We want to be involved with that, so don't leave us out with all that research.
We've got the invite.
I've got heaps of stories, so...
As if you would ever be cut out of that research. As if. You'd be right there, you just...
Perfect,
Yeah,
good.
the philotimo.
Έχουμε μέσον.
And you got meson. But I have to say there's this other incredible two words, right? In Australian it's mateship,
Yep.
and in Greek it's philotimo. and they you can't really translate them, but those two words are really unique.
They really do encompass each other, really.
They do. They do, and it's amazing. It makes me really proud of my two heritage cultures.
Well, look, this has been an unbelievable discussion. Kate, thank you so much for writing the book. We are so proud to have had you here in the studio with us. I highly recommend, if you're listening, get the book, whether it's, a hard copy or the audio book, whatever it is, get your hands on it, listen to it. You're going to love it. Kate, where can we find more about you? Website, social media?
Absolutely. Just Google my name and you will find me.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Fantastic. So just let us know, how many books have you sold? I think you mentioned earlier, Crimson Thread. I know you released it in July, and it's...
Yeah, I don't know what the final figure is, but it's been selling really, really well.
Yeah.
It's really seemed to have struck a chord. There's a lot of books published about World War II, but I think the fact that none of them have ever been set in Crete, or very few, and I also think the fact that I have reinvented or drawn upon ancient Greek myth at a time when people are fascinated by Greek myth. I think it's the conjunction of those two things that have really caught hold of people's attention.
Good stuff. Well done.
Kate Forsyth, thank you very much for being with us. Theodora Gianniotis, as always, thank you very much for being here.
Welcome back.
If you haven't heard the Parthenon Marbles episode, make sure you go back into the catalogue and listen to it. I'm pretty sure we're going to have to invite you back for an update, because I can just feel something's about to happen, right?
Something is about to happen.
Good stuff. Can't wait to hear it.
Well, hopefully we'll be in touch shortly, and we'll have good news, or at least some updates to that story. Thank you very much for being here, Nick.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you
Tom,
very much.
Yeah, awesome. Another amazing batch of storytelling there. How good was that?
I can't wait to go back and listen to this, because there's so much that I want to unpack. As always, WWII Talk. It's the gift that keeps on giving to you and I, isn't it?
Oh, I can't wait to go back and listen to the Crimson Thread. I'm only I think not even halfway yet.
You are going to love it.
You guys have given a lot away, actually. So, but
spoiler
that's okay.
alert! Spoiler.
That's okay. That was good.
We haven't given any of the story. There's a couple of points that we spoke about, but nothing in terms of the storyline. The email is uzotalk@outlook.com. If you've got any questions or if you want to get in touch with us, please send us your emails. On social media, @UzoTalk on most social media platforms, and @Uzo_talk. Nick Athanasiou, thank you very much, mate.
Anastasios, thank you, mate.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Ακολουθήστε μας στο Soundees, στο Spotify, στο Apple Podcasts και στο Google Podcasts.